It was the summer of 2012 when I drove out alone to the Sierra Nevada, telling myself it was just another hiking trip, just another chance to breathe in the dry mountain air and escape the noise of Sacramento. But deep down, I knew I was chasing something else. Something I had heard about years earlier in a half-forgotten story told by an old man who worked the counter of a roadside diner off Highway 49 near Placerville, who swore that deep in those mountains there were shafts abandoned since the gold rush, where voices still spoke from the dark, not the voices of the living, but of those who had gone in search of fortune and never walked back out. He called it the Whisper Vein, a stretch of earth where the mines had collapsed or been sealed, and where, on certain nights when the wind settled, you could hear the echoes of men begging for light, for air, or sometimes calling out names of loved ones who had long since died themselves. At the time, I had laughed it off as ghost story nonsense, another piece of gold country folklore meant to keep kids from wandering into unstable tunnels. But the look in the man's eyes had stayed with me, a kind of weight I couldn't shake. By June of that year, my life was unraveling in ways I didn't care to admit. My job at the small marketing firm in Sacramento was drying up, my relationship had ended badly, and I found myself restless at night, staring at maps of trails I'd already walked and wondering why I felt pulled toward the Sierra as though something waited for me there. On June 10th, I packed my gear, left a vague note for my roommates saying I'd be gone a few days, and drove east until the highway turned into winding mountain roads that clung to ridges above sharp drops, the landscape baking under a clear blue sky. My plan, if you could call it that, was to follow an old mining trail near Downieville, a town that still smelled faintly of its gold rush past, and see if I could find any trace of those shafts the old man had spoken of. The locals I asked at a gas station didn't want to talk much about it. One of them just muttered that the mountains had long memories, and that not all ghosts stayed where they belonged. I shrugged it off, bought extra water, and pushed higher into the mountains until I found a dirt pull-off where a rough track led deeper into pine forest. I parked my car there, shouldered my pack, and started walking under the towering ponderosa pines, the heat of the day giving way to the cool dampness of shade that smelled of resin and earth. The first miles were uneventful, just the steady rhythm of boots on dirt, cicadas buzzing in the trees, and the distant rush of a creek, but I couldn't ignore the strange hush that seemed to settle whenever I stopped, as if the forest itself were listening. Toward evening, I found the remnants of what looked like a collapsed shaft, little more than a rotting timber frame half swallowed by earth, the air around it cooler than the rest of the forest, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me think of rust and stone. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the dark hollow that led nowhere, until I thought, no, I swear, I heard something stir inside, a low murmur like wind caught in a cavern. Except the words I thought I caught were too sharp, too human, syllables that pressed against the edge of understanding before vanishing. My chest tightened and I told myself it was nothing, just air trapped in old rock. But when the sun slid down behind the ridges and shadows deepened, I realized I had no desire to camp near that place. I moved further uphill, found a flat spot near a stand of firs, and set my tent just as twilight bled across the sky, the first stars pricking through. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and tried to let the crackling flames wash away the unease. Yet as the night thickened around me, silence fell so heavy it seemed to press against my ears. And in that silence, I thought again of the legend of the Whisper Vein and the miners who had gone in seeking gold but found only darkness. Somewhere in the distance, faint but deliberate, I heard a sound like stone shifting against stone, followed by what I swear was a voice calling out a single word I couldn't quite catch. I froze, spoon halfway to my lips, the fire throwing sparks into the dark, and in that moment I realized this trip was not going to be like any I had taken before. The fire burned low that night, and though I told myself to sleep, my body resisted, as if the air itself was keeping me awake, and every time I closed my eyes I heard faint noises beyond the tree line, like boots scuffing over gravel or picks striking rock, soft at first, then gone when I sat up and strained to listen, leaving me alone with the thudding of my own heartbeat. I kept remembering the old man's words, How he said the miners called that place cursed because the earth didn't just take their bodies, it kept their voices, and the longer I sat in the silence, the more convinced I became that I wasn't imagining it. Around midnight, the moon rose high, casting pale silver through the branches, and I decided I couldn't stand just sitting there. So I grabbed my flashlight and walked cautiously back toward the collapsed shaft I had found earlier. The woods were unnaturally still, no wind, no insects, no owls, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. And by the time I reached the clearing where the rotten timbers jutted from the earth, I was trembling more from anticipation than from cold. I stood at the edge, shining my light down into the hollow, and saw only dirt, broken stone, and the half-buried remains of rusted rails that must have once carried our carts. But as I leaned closer, I heard it again, unmistakable this time. A voice, low and muffled, echoing up from somewhere far below, calling a name I didn't recognize. Jacob, drawn out as though carried by breath that should not have existed in a sealed tunnel. My throat went dry, and I stumbled back a few steps, nearly tripping on a root. But then curiosity gripped me harder than fear, because it wasn't just one voice now. It was several, overlapping, whispers and murmurs rising like a tide, none of them clear enough to understand, yet all of them so human it made my skin crawl. I forced myself to turn away, telling myself I would leave in the morning. But when I returned to my camp, I found the fire had gone out completely, even though I had banked it carefully, and the air smelled faintly of smoke that wasn't mine, as if someone else's campfire lingered just beyond the trees. I lay in my tent, wrapped tight in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence until exhaustion finally pulled me under, but my dreams were worse than waking. I saw tunnels stretching endlessly into the dark, voices calling from side passages, hands brushing against my shoulders, and when I woke near dawn, I was drenched in sweat, certain I had heard my own name whispered as I slipped out of sleep. The next day, I debated leaving, but something in me refused, some pull I couldn't explain, and instead of hiking back to my car, I found myself pushing deeper into the mountains, following traces of old mining trails half hidden by undergrowth, the broken stumps of rail lines, the stone foundations of shacks long since collapsed. Around noon, I came across a weathered sign nailed to a tree, its paint faded almost to nothing, but I could still make out the words, Prospect Number 7, closed 1874, and beside it a narrow gash in the hillside, mostly filled in by time, but still open enough to see blackness beyond. I stood there a long time, knowing every instinct told me not to step closer, yet also knowing I would, because the air spilling from that shaft was colder than the forest and carried with it the faintest trace of something metallic and sour, and under it all, barely audible, came the steady rhythm of voices whispering in a chorus too faint to understand. I didn't go inside, not yet, but I marked the place in my mind, and as I backed away, I thought I saw a movement just inside the shadows, as if someone had stepped quickly out of sight. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease, and when evening came I built another camp higher up the ridge, but no amount of firelight comforted me. The whispers came again as night fell, drifting through the trees, closer now, no longer bound to the shafts, but moving through the forest itself. Sometimes calling names, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing in hollow tones that froze me to the bone. At one point, I thought I heard my father's voice, even though he had died in 2009, saying my name in the same gentle way he used to wake me for school, and when I turned toward the sound, I saw nothing but trees swaying in a breeze that hadn't existed a moment before. Sleep never came, only a kind of dazed stupor, and when the first light of morning touched the peaks, I knew I had crossed a threshold I could never fully step back from. The mountain had begun to recognize me. By the third night, my nerves were stretched so thin that every sound snapped through me like wire. Yet something stronger than fear kept me from leaving, something like a promise I hadn't made, but was expected to keep. And instead of hiking down toward safety, I found myself circling back to Prospect Number 7 as the day dimmed, drawn as though the mine itself had placed a hook inside me. The entrance yawned black and still, the old timbers sagging under the weight of decades, And when I crouched near the mouth, I felt that same cold draft sliding over my skin, as if the tunnel breathed. I told myself I would only look, just shine my light inside for a moment. But the moment I stepped past the threshold, the world outside seemed to vanish, the sounds of birds and wind cutting off like a switch, leaving only the crunch of gravel under my boots and the faint drip of water echoing somewhere deeper within. The beam of my flashlight cut a narrow cone through the dark, glinting off rails eaten by rust and walls streaked with quartz and iron, and for a time nothing stirred but dust. Then, as I reached a bend where the tunnel forked, the whispers began again, louder now, overlapping in a dozen voices, some pleading, some calling, one of them so sharp and close it made me stumble back. It was my own name, spoken in my mother's voice, though she was alive and hundreds of miles away in Oregon. I spun, shining the light everywhere, but the passage was empty, only damp stone and sagging beams, yet the sound carried on, weaving through the darkness like threads pulling me deeper. Against every ounce of reason I followed, drawn down the left passage, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe, and the air grew colder, my breath visible in thin white puffs though outside it had been nearly 80 degrees. The walls narrowed, the ceiling dipped, and the whispers grew into a chorus, some clear, some garbled, but all filled with a desperate weight that pressed against my mind until I thought I might break. At one point I lifted the beam to the wall and froze because carved into the stone were names, dozens of them, etched by hands long gone. Samuel, Elias, Thomas, and further down, Jacob, the same name I had heard called on that first night. My stomach turned because some of the names looked freshly scratched, the edges still sharp, as if time had not touched them at all. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the darkness became until my flashlight began to flicker, and in that failing light, I saw something move at the far end of the passage, a shape not quite formed, pale and shifting, like smoke given the outline of a man. It raised its head as if to look at me, and for an instant I thought I saw eyes, not glowing, not bright, just human eyes filled with exhaustion and hunger, and then it was gone, swallowed back into the black. My legs trembled, and I nearly turned back, but the whispers surged again, and one voice cut through all the rest, a woman's voice crying, "Help me," so clear and anguished that tears stung my eyes. I stumbled forward, deeper still, until the tunnel opened into a cavern where broken timbers sprawled across the floor and old tools lay scattered in the dirt as if dropped mid-strike. The air was so cold it burned, and from every direction the voices rose, no longer whispers but wails, hundreds of them overlapping, men shouting orders, children crying, women calling names, all rising and falling in a chaos that pressed against my chest until I thought my ribs would crack. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, and in that moment the voices shifted, unified, and all together they spoke my name, drawn out long and low, a sound so unnatural it felt as if the mountain itself had spoken through them. My light sputtered and went out, plunging me into blackness absolute, and in that darkness I felt hands, not solid, not flesh, but cold currents of air shaped like fingers, brush across my shoulders and arms, tugging me gently but insistently toward the deepest part of the cavern. I fought against it, gasping, clawing at the dirt, whispering to myself that this was not real, but another part of me knew that it was, that I had stepped into the heart of the whisper vein, and it was showing me exactly what it wanted me to see. For what felt like hours I stayed there, pressed into the earth, surrounded by voices that rose and fell like tides, until suddenly, as if some unseen line had been crossed, the noise ceased, the cold lifted, and I was left in silence so complete it roared in my ears. My flashlight blinked back to life on its own, its beam trembling across the cavern, and there before me, scratched into the far wall in letters jagged and frantic, was my own last name, carved as if by desperate hands, though I had never been there before. I don't remember leaving the mine in any ordinary sense. Only that one moment I was staring at my own name carved into the stone, and the next I was stumbling into pale morning light, my hands scraped and raw as if I had clawed through dirt, my clothes coated in dust, and my backpack half torn open as though I had dragged it along the ground instead of carrying it. The air outside was warm again, the sun already high, and for a long while I just sat at the mouth of the shaft gasping, unable to reconcile how much time had passed. My watch had stopped completely sometime in the night, frozen at 2:17, and when I pulled out my phone I saw the date had advanced not one, but 2 full days since I had last checked it. I told myself I must have collapsed, that maybe I had suffered heat exhaustion or some kind of breakdown. But no matter how I tried to frame it, the memory of the voices lingered sharp and undeniable, and the raw ache in my chest where they had spoken my name felt too real to dismiss. I forced myself to hike back toward my car, every step heavy, every rustle of the forest making me flinch, and when at last I reached the pull-off, the relief nearly broke me. My car was still there, dustier than before but untouched, and I drove back down winding roads in a daze, stopping only once in Downieville for water and gas. The attendant at the pump gave me a long look and finally asked if I had been up near the old shafts, and when I didn't answer he simply nodded, as if he had seen this before, and said quietly, "Sometimes the mountain keeps what it wants, sometimes it just lets you walk away." I didn't know what to say, so I paid and left, the words circling in my head all the way back to Sacramento. In the weeks that followed, I tried to settle back into ordinary life, but the ordinary had slipped through my fingers. At night, I still heard whispers curling through the corners of my apartment, sometimes so faint I almost believed I imagined them, other times so sharp and close they made me sit bolt upright in bed. Once, late in July, as I walked home from a bar, I heard my name called in the exact same voice I had heard in the mine, low and stretched and thick with sorrow. And when I turned, there was no one behind me, only the empty street. I began to research the mines, searching archives and old newspapers, and what I found chilled me further. Prospect number 7 had collapsed in 1874, killing at least 30 miners whose bodies were never recovered. And among the list of the dead was a man named Jacob Whitman, the same name I had heard called on that first night. Stranger still, tucked in a report from the Nevada County Gazette, was a reference to a foreman with my own last name. No relation I could trace, no family link, but the coincidence rattled me. The paper noted that before the collapse he had insisted the men heard voices in the shafts and that he had begged the company to abandon the site, warnings they dismissed until it was too late. I shut my laptop and sat in silence for a long time, realizing that perhaps the mountain had not simply chosen me at random, that maybe blood and memory and earth are all tied in ways we don't see until it is far too late. Even now, years later, I don't hike the Sierra anymore, though sometimes I feel them calling when the wind rises at night. I avoid old tunnels, skip road trips east, and yet I know the whisper vein hasn't finished with me. I know this because last winter, on the night of December 21st, the solstice again, the long dark night, I woke in my apartment at exactly 2:17, the same time my watch had stopped in the mine, to find a thin layer of dust across my kitchen floor as though I had tracked it in from somewhere deep underground. I stood there in the stillness, listening, and faintly beneath the hum of the refrigerator I heard it. A single voice, low and endless, drawing my name out of the walls. The sound grew softer until it vanished, but I know it will come back. I know the mountain is patient.